the hostages. Well, the war in Gaza and the release of the hostages have put so much political pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And let's discuss that with Dalia Schendlin, who's a political analyst and fellow at the think tank Century International in Tel Aviv for us now. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. There must be anger, as we were hearing, and frustration really from hostage families, that this is a deal that's been agreed today that was first put on the table way back in May by Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think that's been the word on the street among much of the Israeli public for much of this week. The one thing we keep hearing people say is, if this was the same deal that was on the table back in May, why did it have to wait this long? But we should remember that criticism, although it seems very widespread, you hear this on everybody's lips and in television studios and just talking to regular people and families of the hostages. At the same time, there is a minority who has been opposed to a hostage deal. It's anywhere roughly around, I would say, a quarter of the Israeli public right now is against a hostage deal, and about 70% is generally for it. But that small minority is, of course, the minority that the government is listening to, because the issue has become so terribly politicized, such that the right-wing government has been avoiding a hostage deal up until now and making the case about why it would not have been right to sign that deal now at any point up until now. Even now, of course, we see key ministers, coalition allies in Netanyahu's government, who are openly and bitterly opposed to this deal and have been saying nonstop for the last 2 days what a terrible deal it is, which is deepening the rift even further. It's really an agonizing process to watch the rest of Israeli society, the majority, and of course the families of the hostages, listen and react to that kind of thing. And it's almost like they don't have any disappointment left in them. They're just so demoralized by that kind of resistance from within the government that's supposed to represent all Israeli citizens to getting their hostages back.
So why do you think Mr. Netanyahu has finally agreed to this deal that he wouldn't agree to months ago? Is it because he's been pushed into it, frankly, by Donald Trump?
I can tell you that is the widespread speculation. I think there is a dearth of hard empirical information about exactly what's changed his mind. But certainly the broad perception is that Donald Trump put some sort of pressure on both sides, apparently. There's a little bit of a dispute among the observation, people who are observing what's going on here about whether Trump pressured Hamas more or pressured Israel more and Netanyahu. But the fact is, there wasn't much more you could do to pressure Hamas. And so if anybody, and Hamas has been essentially supportive of it, has wanted a deal on a ceasefire for most of this time. And so there is a general understanding that the U.S. government, or the incoming U.S. government, of course, President-elect Trump, has found a way to be very convincing to Netanyahu. In my analysis, that can either be a matter of incentives or pressure tactics. And if it's not one of those, then it's mainly that Netanyahu decided the time was right. So it's either, the only factor that would have changed as an external factor would be Trump's very strong statements that by the time he comes into office, he wants this thing settled. And that somehow had a magical effect on Netanyahu. Again, I think it's not magical. It's either pressure or incentives. But if it wasn't that, then it's Netanyahu's own calculation that this is the time to do it, maybe because he wants to be in the good graces of Trump, and it's not because of any particular incentive or pressure. And that in itself has also reverberated very poorly in Israeli society, because there are Israelis who are saying, why are Trump's desires more important than the citizens of Israel who've wanted their family members back this whole time?
And what do you think Israelis will make of the deal and the specifics of the deal, which mean that hundreds of Palestinian prisoners will be released by Israel in exchange for the hostages? I think a ratio of 30 per hostage, up to 50 per female soldier hostage. What will be the view in Israeli society of that? Will they see that as something that is simply necessary to get the hostages home?
The word simply does not apply here. Israelis are very happy about the deal and simultaneously tormented and agonizing over it. And of course, the release of Palestinian prisoners, particularly those who have actually been convicted of security offenses and terror attacks, is very, very painful and difficult because, everybody remembers that Yahya Sinwar himself was released in the deal for the exchange with the Israeli prisoner who was an IDF soldier who was kidnapped by Hamas in that was in 2006. He was released in 2011 in exchange for 1,027 prisoners, and one of them was Yahya Sinwar. So Israelis, of course, know of the dangers of that, and they do not take that lightly at all. But right now, there's no question that, again, for about 70% of the population, very consistently, the number one priority is get the hostages back. And however we have asked those questions over the course of 15 months, the majority have always supported getting the hostage back, even though the price is big. But I think the other agonizing part of this for Israelis is that the deal is so incrementally phased out that even in the first phase, there will only be 33 of the hostages who are going to be released. So there's a big price to pay in terms of Palestinian prisoners who are going to be released. It could reach over 1,000, and the formulas are actually just coming out. According to one piece of information we've gotten, certain Israeli hostages will carry 110 Palestinian prisoners, so it will reach over 1,000. That's already difficult for Israelis, but the biggest difficulty is knowing that 33 will be released. Nobody knows if this will actually reach the second phase. The negotiations for the second phase of this release of this deal will only begin part of the way through the first, and Israel has a long history of failing to reach the next phases of phased agreements when it comes to the Palestinians. So there is absolute uncertainty about whether the rest of the hostages will come out, and that puts everybody in a very tortured position.
Yeah, such a long way to go, as you say, those whole 3 phases, 2 depends on 1 and 3 depends on 1 and 2 being successful. But if we look into the long term and assume all of that is successful and does work as is planned, what is the long-term future of Gaza? What do Israelis want to see in Gaza?
Well, this is a very complicated question, because I think that we can't just assume there's this possibility that all the 3 phases will play out. If the 3 phases do play out, that's great. But Israelis, I think, are assuming that the fighting will probably start again. And I think even Netanyahu has said that if there is such a deal, it will certainly be broken at some point, whether it's in the phases or after the phases. And so I think that we shouldn't take for granted that there is that kind of a next day. The fighting could easily restart again. And in terms of what Israelis want to see, I mean, there's not a clear consensus about this. Most of all, if you look at any of the kinds of survey questions that test this, what we'll see is that a majority or a plurality will say, well, Israel should retain security control. The majority do not necessarily support Israel maintaining civilian control, which would mean something like a full-out military occupation over the 2.3 million Gazan civilians. But the fact is that is a sort of a term that people use, a kind of distinction that people make in Israel between security control and civilian control. But I have to say that in the West Bank, what we know over the decades is that that's a bit of an artificial separation. It's not, there really can't be any separation. If you have full security control the way Israel has implemented it, ultimately it affects everything about civilian life in Gaza. So I think that Israelis are wrong to see that as some sort of an option to distinguish between those. And there have also been surveys showing that a significant portion of Israelis, anywhere between 30 and 50% of Israeli Jews, depending on which survey and which month, even support the reconstruction of Israeli settlements in Gaza. And of course, there are key parties in the coalition who have openly advocated for annexing Gaza and rebuilding Jewish settlements there. And I think the government has not given up on that at all. Those ministers are very vocal and very open about their intentions. And I think that it's true that the ceasefire deal makes it look like maybe that scenario is being staved off for a while. But I think, it can't be dismissed entirely, even at this stage.
All right. Well, it's very good to get your thoughts and your analysis. Fascinating to hear your assessment of where Israelis are with all of this. Dalia Shenlin, there, political analyst and fellow at the think tank Century International in Tel Aviv. Many thanks for being on BBC News.
Thank you for having me.